Thank you, Hannah. So today we have doctoral candidate Sinduja Raja presenting on women's rights after war on paper, legal discourse and limitations. Sinduja is a doctoral candidate from the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver, where her fields of study include gender and security. Her research focuses on understanding the gendered relationship between state, society, and violence, particularly in South Asia. Sinduja is the project manager of the Women's Rights After War project, which evaluates women's rights interventions that followed war in several countries to further our understandings of how to advance women's rights and equality in the aftermath of war and vital prerequisites. She is one of 10 awardees of the C Fellowship and Scholarship from the C Center for International Security and Diplomacy. And prior to her time at the University of Denver, she obtained a Master of Arts in Development Studies from the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras, where her master's thesis focused on the indeterminate status of the Indian peacekeeping forces deployed in the Sri Lankan Civil War. So as usual, our speaker will present for 50 minutes, and then we will have 25 minutes for questions from the audience. As always, we ask that your questions be short and wait until the end of the talk and be on topic of the talk. For those of you on Zoom, you can put your questions in the Q&A function, and Elizabeth will read them out to the room. And for those of you in the room, we will gladly pass the mic for your questions. So with that, I welcome Sinduja.
Thanks to the Women in Policy program and the organizers of the Women in Peace Negotiation series for organizing this talk and for inviting me to speak at our project. As they mentioned, I'm Sinduja Raja. I'm the project manager of Women's Rights After War. And I'd like to particularly thank Laura for coordinating to bring me here. Today, I'm going to be presenting on our ongoing research from Women's Rights After War, which looks at the connections between gender equality, conflict, and legislative change. So to start off, I would first like to locate our research in previous work that's been looked at the effect of war in relation to women. So while numerous studies have kind of documented the unique and explicit ways that war can be disruptive and destructive in women's lives, a newer crop of literature on war showed how war can be a period of progressive change to women as well. So the PIs of the project, Dr. Berry and Dr. Lake, noted this in their own work, but this also followed along work by Tripp, Hughes, Vitorna, and who showed how war kind of disrupts existing hierarchies and provides women space to enter new arenas of political and social life that they didn't previously have. So because war is so fundamentally kind of restructures how power operates in society, power is reconfigured in a way that women are able to mobilize both through and after the war. And this is also because there is significant institutional disjuncture through the period of conflict that it allows for international legal frameworks to fill in domestic vacuums. So a combination of these two shows how while war is very destructive, it can also be incredibly transformative. In this regard, this came at a time when, with the advent of the Women, Peace and Security agenda, a great deal of attention had been paid to the issue of women's political, legal, and economic rights in conflict-affected countries, because governments were particularly incentivized and motivated to kind of end and improve their gender gaps. And this was also supplemented by a large body of work that was showing that suggested that gender equality indicated long-term peace. So in some ways, our project kind of began with a suspicion of this claim, like, can we really say that increased gender equality in the way that it was currently being formulated would lead to long-term durable peace, particularly in divided post-war societies, which are fractured along identity cleavages. We wanted to understand how the advancement of certain kinds of women can undermine prospects of peace or in the process of trying to advance it. So in some ways, that's where we located our central questions, which is in deeply divided post-war contexts, which women actually get to benefit from post-war gender reforms, right? What can who benefits tell us really about the prospects for durable and lasting peace and the promise of gender equality as a whole? And in what ways do the dynamics of post-war inclusion shape possibilities for gender equality or facilitate new forms of gendered violence? So in this regard, the project design itself, this project began well before the pandemic, but then really got hit by the pandemic, as most research projects did at this time. So initially we began with the idea that we had to look at this as a cross-country study, right, of around 10 countries that had emerged from conflict during and after the advent of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. And we use this as a cutoff because unlike previous kinds of congregations around gender equality, the Women, Peace and Security agenda particularly gave a plan of action for countries to follow. So initially we began with the idea of 10 countries, which was Afghanistan, Bosnia, Congo, Colombia, Iraq, and Kurdistan, Liberia, Nepal, Rwanda, Sri Lanka, and Uganda. However, with the advent of the pandemic and given our own capacities to be able to do this work justice, we had to kind of truncate it around 6 countries, and we ended up with Colombia, Nepal, Rwanda, Sri Lanka, Bosnia, and Iraq. In some ways, this also helped us give us a bit of a pairing, because in Colombia and Nepal were countries that had seen, again, very long-term conflicts. Colombia had almost a 50-year civil war, and so did Nepal, around 30 years. And both of them had peace agreement negotiations reached at the end of their wars, and sort of a mixed governance structure that emerged post their conflicts. Then we also, and then Rwanda and Sri Lanka helped us look at a decisive victory of one faction over another. In Rwanda, it was the Rwandan Patriotic Front, and in Sri Lanka, it was the national government at the time. And in Bosnia and Iraq, Kurdistan, there were ethnic agreements that had been reached. So Bosnia had been kind of split up into its different cantons based on ethnicity, and Iraq and the Kurdish region of Iraq was carved out of Iraq. So, and this helped us also. And then we decided to split the work up into 3 parts. Initially, we began with desk research, where we would kind of focus on building our own base of understanding of what we meant by these women's rights reforms and how women were being represented in the post-war context. The second part was to delve deeper into how these post-war reforms actually took place and how they were experienced by the people who they were meant for. And the third part, which was third part ended up being a larger scale survey and a mix of survey and arts-based methods. And one other thing that we noticed with the project itself was that generally reforms were classified into these 6 arenas. So they were political reform in where the idea was to include more women into political institutions, mainstream political institutions. Then there were civil and family reforms, where rights were changed the way marriage laws work, changed the way land rights work. Then there were criminal law reforms, where there were newer laws being placed on what actually was considered a crime against women in particular, or gender or gender as in general. And then we had economic reforms, which looked at how to increase women's participation into the labor market, how to increase their access to economic resources. We also then we had transitional justice reforms, and which were essentially how to do the wrongs, how to do right to the wrongs done during the conflict. And then there were also international gender agreements that a lot of these countries that emerged from conflict entered into, like CEDAW and the WPS agenda, where they all had national action plans. So in order to study this, of course, like I said, the pandemic made us kind of pivot here and from our original plan into different directions. But initially, we began with a qualitative database of all women's rights reforms in the 6 countries that are our focus, which is now available on our website. We now have a database we also had a database of women representatives at the parliamentary levels and local levels of the last 2 election cycles, in order to understand women's political representation, how laws kind of brought that into effect. The third part, which was I think the major chunk of the project, is qualitative interviews with different stakeholders who worked on these women's rights reforms, who benefited from women's rights reforms, who got to be in positions of power through these women's rights reforms. When we selected 6 sub-regions randomly within our countries, and conducted qualitative fieldwork through interviews and focus groups. And the last part, which initially we had envisioned it to be more participatory feminist research, where we wanted to use tools like photo voice, which was like more workshop methods of conducting research in order to understand how the effects of these reforms on people, because of the pandemic and the opportunities kind of got truncated. So we recently had extended an arts-based methodology and survey methods to our project to understand both the reform, but also how alternatives to reforms kind of take place within society. So what are the larger points that the project makes? We kind of bring notice to that. We posit that the advancement of certain groups of women, particularly in divided post-war contexts, can facilitate the continuation of structural racial and ethnicized violence. We posit that selective inclusion through right reforms can foment and create social fissures that exacerbate grievances and inequalities linked to war. The reforms advance specific kinds of women to power that then shows up ethnic or racial categories more, instead of creating a fundamental transformation of hierarchy. And this is the larger proposition that the project makes. And in order to talk, to give you a sense of how these propositions came to be, I'd like to take you through 2 strands of our primary findings, which is the first is the political instrumentalization of women's rights. And I'll begin this with a story about Bandini. Bandini is from Colombo in Sri Lanka. She's a well-known champion of women's rights in Sri Lanka, frequently invited to international conferences and asked to speak on the women, peace, and security agenda. Yet she is frustrated. All of the women governors, she notes, have actively advocated against women's rights and only advocate for the government. These women ignore the suffering of women during the war, especially those who suffered at the hands of the government, which in Sri Lanka, they had a decisive victory. Instead, women in politics are just used as a political platform, but they have no commitment to rights or justice. In Sri Lanka, therefore, the promotion of women into politics under a recently introduced gender quota law lends a veneer of legitimacy to a regime that continues to perpetuate mass human rights abuses. Tamil women in particular remain politically marginalized and are subject to continued violence at the hands of the state. And this is Bandini's reflections are kind of familiar to other feminist scholars of rights who shine a spotlight on the limitations and inadequacies of women's empowerment streams, highlighting that international norms and frameworks promoting women's inclusion neglect to fundamentally transform the gendered power relations and institutions that produce women's marginalization in the first place. For example, even in Nepal, the government of Nepal again has quota reservations for economic quota laws, for political quota laws, which say that a certain number of seats at the parliamentary and the local election has to be given to women, right? But the government of Nepal made, and as a social activist in Parsa notes, the government of Nepal made reservations for women, such as to have a ward chairperson or member, or a mayor or a deputy mayor. But now what the parties have done is to make men the mayor and women always the deputy mayor. And this is something that we corroborate through our, evidence on election cycles and seeing who has actually come to power. The committee does not actually want to keep women. Similarly, in Nepal, again, the women who are in power bring their wife to power. So what then ends up happening is right reforms towards political opportunities create spaces for co-optation by more powerful members of society. And we dub this a strategic instrumentalization of women's rights, where certain aspects of women's rights, even when seemingly marginalized people are brought into the fold of mainstream politics, the question then arises whether they're just there as a signpost. Not only is it about what they bring to the agenda of women's rights and gender justice, but also what they hide, especially when they're elected in the service of mainstream party agendas. Importantly, reformist approaches frequently overlook how rights or inclusion efforts can differentially empower certain women within inegalitarian social orders and women from certain ethnic, religious, linguistic, political, or educational backgrounds who may stand to disproportionately benefit from new rights and opportunities. Similarly, again, Dalit women in the caste-based ethnic order within Nepal, Dalit women are often seen at the lower rung of the hierarchy, right? And this is a social worker, Dalit social worker, who asks this question. What really is the situation for Dalit women within politics? They are nowhere. There is a provision there should be one Dalit woman from every ward and province. I have some. What happened was that the political party came to every ward and they took one Dalit woman, but wanted that woman to represent only the party. So that representative was not a representative for the Dalit, but for the party as a whole. Critically, we argue that in post-war context, these gains are often those affiliated with the victorious party or military. And I think this is particularly prevalent in Rwanda, which is another case that we look at. Women in our research reveal how the incorporation of women into politics often serves an explicit political agenda. Rwanda, for example, boasts the world's highest level of women in politics. And yet it has been well documented that these women are disproportionately from an ethnic minority that is closely aligned with the ruling regime. Moreover, the number of women in Rwanda's politics has served as a seemingly progressive and democratic smokescreen that masks the regime's otherwise authoritarian practices, which in recent times has been lots of like repression of journalists, lots of repression of any kind of gender, LGBTQ rights, etc. Across the globe, we see how women from dominant factions and privileged elites can find their way easily into politics, while women associated with opposition parties, adversaries, or alternative ethnic, religious, or racial identities, or even political platforms, face continued barriers to access. Since women's political inclusion is increasingly met with reward domestically and internationally, gendered inclusion can offer a new canvas through which political parties can pursue a politics of exclusion and marginalization. This is particularly damaging for prospects of peace when dominant post-war factions use reserved seats to explicitly exclude women from particular caste, class, ethnic, political, or religious backgrounds. And in Rwanda, for example, 61% of parliament are women. However, there is constant reports of widespread violations of human rights. It's considered to be an ethnic minority authoritarian regime. The second aspect of our evidence that I'd like to walk you through is how some of our rights reforms actually replicate certain hierarchies of violence that led to that kind of like propagated the war in the first place. So I'll begin this again with another anecdote from Mona, who's a political activist in Janakpur, a city in southern Nepal, which actually shares a border with India. It's in the Tarai region. We ask her about how women affected by the Maoist insurgency have been able to receive compensation or justice from the state. But Mona tells us none of the women are actually healthy in this region. The list of ailments she recounts is very long. Women have gastric problems, cancer, arthritis, high blood pressure, diabetes, infertility, cataract problems. Children have pneumonia, jaundice, and deformities of the lips or limbs. All of this started in the last 10 years, she notes. The temperature is growing worse because everywhere there is concrete only. As you can see, there are no trees. Scholars of war and violence have overwhelmingly focused on harm and suffering that emerges directly from the hands of other human beings via weaponry and the mechanisms of like modern militarism. Yet, ecologists have shown how calamities of differing temporalities require our focus, right? Especially with the imminent threat of climate collapse. While studies on the health impacts of both ambient and indoor air pollution in Nepal are limited, best estimates are that 15,000 Nepalis die from air pollution-related illnesses each year. That is, more Nepalis actually die from air pollution than who died during the 10-year Maoist insurgency or the 2015 earthquake, both of which received immense international aid and development. So with imminent climate collapse, there's been increasing public awareness around the interconnected plight of human and planetary well-being. And we draw on Rob Nixon's conception of slow violence to talk about this, because it results in suffering of bodies, soils, communities, and groups, right? He also illustrates that the kind of environmental slow damage that we are seeing is often linked to war, right? So in the carcinogens of arms and bombs, or unexploded landmines, or pesticides used to clear brush for assault, etc. At the same time, much of this slow violence is linked to neoliberal projects and capitalist extraction more generally, right? Javier Ayuero and Deborah Alejandra Swinston describe toxicity in the urban periphery as a form of violence itself, whereby toxicity offenges from petrochemical plants and other industrial production facilities. Such proximity to toxic danger actually creates profound insecurity in people's lives. We find across our cases that there is still a privileging of certain forms of violence, specifically stemming from the war and the conflict, and specifically related to bodily violence, in both rights reforms and via massive peacekeeping missions, government advisories, international agreements, and other toolkits of support. So what this does is the other manifestations of slow, oblique, banal violence continue to persist and are often subordinated by rights reforms linked to war. Again, this is something that Sofia, another activist we spoke to in Cartagena, in Colombia. Sofia is actually in Cartagena now because she has lived from 2001, but she's from a more remote village in Colombia's Bolivar department and was displaced by the war, by paramilitary violence. She has watched a series of peace processes because, the Colombian war went on for so long that they have seen multiple iterations of what peace should look like, complete with sweeping gender reforms, attempt to build peace for her and millions of others displaced by more than 5 decades of conflict. Yet she tells us the situation of women in Colombia before, during, and after the senseless war that we experienced has not really changed much. This is because for grassroots women, or the peasant women, who's one that still experiences war, conflicts, or where she lives, their situation is still the same. We, the women, have always been repressed by this constant pattern of violence and have never been able to free ourselves from it. We experience not only violence at the hands of armed groups, but also domestic violence, gender-based violence. Due to the conflict we've experienced, that is more obvious and easier to see. But violence against women is what has kept us submissive in every other single area of life. I think Sophia draws our attention to the slower violence of patriarchy itself. While war asks us to kind of focus on the spectacular forms of violence of bombs being thrown or like limbs being cut off, or even sexual violence during war, which has again gained lots of traction in most peace, even in the women, peace and security and gender. Bodily violence is something that's very much put at the forefront. The insidiousness of gender-based oppression is a pervasive source of harm in women's lives that stretches on a continuum far before and after armed conflict. Like the slow violence of environmental calamity, gender-based violence is also linked in particular ways to armed conflict, because war does legitimize men as agents of violence and position women as victims. However, Cynthia Coburn has argued patriarchal gender relations and the sex-gender hierarchy are itself a cause of war or violence, right? So violence is sometimes a far more banal practice as a daily reality, rarely factors into conversations about redressing gender violence after war, especially when people who experience war also think about violence in much expansive terms. So what does this mean? It really shows that how an overwhelming focus on right reforms, especially in realizing gender justice and linking that to peace, has obscured underlying structures of violence, because rights as reforms tend to focus on single axis issues. Here, specifically gender, but I wouldn't even say gender, I would actually just say women, right? As this quote by Dylan Rodriguez notes, to reform a system is to adjust isolated aspects of its operation in order to protect that system from total collapse, whether by internal or external forces. Such adjustments usually rest on the fundamental assumptions that these systems must remain intact, even as they consistently produced asymmetrical misery, suffering, premature death, and violent life conditions for certain people and places. So, and this is not only noted by scholars or activists, right? This is noted by people who are currently on the ground doing the work of rebuilding life after war. So and I think this is a very evocative imagery, because the social activist from Parsa notes how rights reforms are like elephant's tusks. An elephant has two big tusks. It scares people. The tusks are actually not used to eat, though. He has another tooth inside his mouth. Likewise, political parties have taken policy to show that we are sensitive towards women, as they have done in their policy. But now it's just a show, just like tusks. It really doesn't seem to have implemented that policy, because we see that which political party do we see has given the ticket of mayor to a woman? So in some ways, it shows how rights reforms can only do a layered, take such a top layer approach to the idea of gender justice, or even to the idea of peace. Because when we met Peace in Kigali in Rwanda, she's unemployed, a 23-year-old secondary school graduate who we met in Kigali. Against the backdrop of Rwanda's decision to provide secondary education to all regardless of gender, girls accepted at secondary school are often excited about the opportunity to continue in school. So this is, again, a top-down policy, right? But once they arrive, they discover many hidden costs. Peace found that in addition to accommodation and food, she faced the expectations to look the part of a modern girl. Hair plaited, styling is expected, soap and lotion establish status among peers, and traditional African fabrics are often shunned and associated with life in the village. So Peace explained how these expenses motivate her to take a sugar daddy. When you don't have a job, you can't provide yourself with everything you need, clothes, lotion, hair styling. The thing is that we will go for anything because it's the only way to get money. It's the only option we have. And in her case, and in the case of many other Rwandan women and girls, claiming the rights of a 21st century Rwandan woman was not really as straightforward as it hoped, because there's an underlying structure of patriarchy that is still very pervasive within Rwandan society. So in some ways, these show us how rights-based frameworks aimed at advancing gender equality fail, but they do not seek to unravel other forms of suffering or harm. So state-centered, liberal, top-down reforms that extend rights based on narrow subject positions, here women, or in some ways without even gender, women in particular, and they even fortify unjust hierarchical relations that are responsible for further gender injustice and other harms. Women's rights after war have limited ability to advance gender justice if they do not seek to unravel other forms of suffering and harm. So what we're trying to do, I think, with the research, with our project now, is to invite a new phase in research on women's rights that moves beyond the vacuous idea of inclusion into oppressive systems as a route to transformation, and instead foregrounding a commitment to recreating and rebuilding systems that will inhibit the fertilization of further oppression, right? So including war and gender justice in their very design. So and in some ways, the project has taken its time to understand what this would mean or what this would look like. And I don't know if we have all the answers, but now I will kind of take you through some of the ways we have tried to work through this ourselves. So legal frameworks in post-war environments attempt to create space for women in unstable and deeply flawed systems that were often the roots of conflict in the first place. Instead, our interlocutors often identify themes that they think are important to societal transformation and will avoid the pitfalls created by legal mechanisms. So, for example, the activist one of the activists we met in Pasikura, Sri Lanka, where, again, Sri Lanka, the entirety of the Northeast was affected by the war, but there were certain parts of Northeast Sri Lanka where there's still a high volume of missing or disappeared people, and most of their family members still have no idea what happened to these people. Tamil men, generally they're men. So, and as she notes, she's like, I don't want prosecutions. I don't need prosecutions. I am actually okay with giving amnesty, but I need to know, I need information. I need to know what happened to my husband, because my son is now 12 years old and he doesn't know what's happened. He sees the picture of his father is hanging in the house, but he doesn't know what happened to him, right? So they identify empty spaces in the laws that are usually around repair, healing, and some kind of structural change. For example, as seen above, through the kind of information and accountability that's needed to kind of actually think about justice in a holistic sense. And importantly, as this is another activist from Cartagena, Colombia, who was forcibly displaced during the war, moved to Cartagena during the war, is now part of almost like a women-run household that came to exist as a result of the war, because they had to build these non-traditional families based on community in search of better opportunities in future in a different place. So she talks to us about how not many opportunities for us. We were also the ones that led the way and decided to get organized, decided to figure out what we were going to do in a city where we were completely helpless and we didn't have the support of our families. So we started to look for ways to survive in this unfamiliar situation. And the L, I think, talks really about require a provision of material life, the components of a life that they can lead now, along with the intangible aspects of like justice, which is accountability, healing, acknowledgement, community, building communities and families that make sense. So I think what we are trying to do now is to imagine how mainstream thinking charts a path towards gender equality through our existing institutions of power. So it's about getting more women to government, getting them into militaries and negotiate as negotiators at peace tables, etc. However, what if a path towards gender equality charted a new course and instead centered communities long marginalized at the peripheries of global politics, who have created alternative kind of models of coexistence? So we are trying to imagine what it would take to have post-war societies in which everyone has all of the things they need. So we don't have the answers, but we have attempted to try answer our own questions, right, in whatever way possible, which is kind of the more recent part of our research project, which we were initially thinking of doing a far more participatory work like Photo Voice, which was more like a photography workshop with victims of the war, victims of conflict, which ended up becoming a collaborative art workshop recently that we had this past summer in Bogota. In order to explore these questions further, we realized that sometimes traditional methods of both research and of granting justice are unable to capture the complexity of what justice even entails, especially when formal legal mechanisms don't bring kind of the expected benefits to victims. And even our own language for research depends on relationship to these institutional structures, right? So in some ways, we tried to think about how could we bring out more answers to these questions without recreating or reprising the problems that we have identified, right? So we kind of looked at art as methodology to explore what peace and justice could look like from a completely different kind of vantage point that is not necessarily tied to the institutions we already know. So, and this is rooted in, this is very nascent literature. I mean, there is hope that there will be more in the upcoming years. But there is this idea that art is actually a form of transitional justice from below, because it allows people to engage in the creation of transitional justice themselves. It helps them capture ideas and helps them capture strategies that don't come through your traditional transitional justice mechanisms, which are prosecutions or trials or reparations, etc. And what art does is also provides a language for experiences that are difficult to share in traditional spaces. Sometimes when most of our participants, for example, had to go through trials, or like in Rwanda had the Gakaka courts where they had to go and present their case and have people like judge them, judge whether they had the evidence to prove it, etc. And some certain heavier concepts, right, heavier struggles and heavier tragedies that have emerged through war were difficult for them to speak about in these environments. So I think art helps them kind of provide a language for these experiences, and it also helps to see kind of justice as a communal activity and not individual. What often you hear about is reparations to individual families, or based on how much violence they have faced, right? Where violence is often scaled between what is the worst form of violence, what is the least form of violence, and how much can we give money. Or it's based on prosecutions where each individual case is taken separately. But oftentimes, war is experienced communally. So how can we then think about justice as a communal activity, right? And I think art methods or art as methodology helps to bridge those gaps. So this was a 3-day collaborative workshop that we held in Bogota, Colombia. Estéticas de Resistencia, or the Aesthetics of Resistance, was a collaborative collage workshop between our project and a social photography collective called Radar. We worked with 2 researchers and 2 collage artists from Argentina, Lucila Quieto and Natalia Fortuny, who themselves had faced, are using art and their medium of collage to express the kind of grievances they had during the Argentinian dictatorship. So, and together with women victims from the Colombian War, where we co-created this space for them to speak about their experience using the medium of collage. So it was initially, there was a pre-workshop, and then we had a day where they built their collages. In the pre-workshop, actually, we brought together, these were women who had diverse experiences of the more than 50-year conflict in Colombia, from the disappearance of family members to executions of husbands or sons, to those who were killed as false positives by the government, where the government just shot a bunch of civilians and claimed them to be rebels, and and recently they've been having to do a lot of like uncovering of those histories, right? And these were women who were from displaced areas, etc. Some women, like some of these women, also came from victim groups who were actually traditionally seen as oppositional to each other. So, like some of the government soldier groups, some of these women, there was a mixture of women from the conflict. And they were first brought together in a pre-workshop where they met each other, met the facilitators, and understood that this was a space for them to kind of bring their experience of not just the conflict, but also of the period after the conflict. Excuse me. So they were asked to bring pictures, documents, news clippings, feathers, etc., and anything that held meaning to them, basically. And I think this was such a rewarding experience because you could see how the medium of collage helped to showcase sort of evocative experiences and to display the fullness of conflict and the post-conflict experience. These are just some examples of the final collages that came through. It really shows not just, this person particularly, it was about the Palacia de Justice. There was an attack in the Palace of Justice, and a bunch of workers, government workers, people there were just killed, right? And there's been no prosecutions. There's been no, there has been like hardly a recognition that these were also victims of the war. These were done by parts of the group. So in some ways, it was helped to bring them on paper and to bring them into reality. And then similarly, the women used actual materials from their case papers that they had submitted to the government as part of this process, because the experience of conflict was also the experience of submitting these documents to the government, right? Like to show that they were victims, to show that they had an issue. And so it helped them kind of like visually put together elements that could never be together. So sometimes we create distinctions between the war and post-war. And I think like the collage as a medium helped them put together the war in post-war in ways that could not have been done earlier. And also to bring people who are missing or killed. So some of the human beings you actually see in the collages are their family members who are disappeared or killed, who they actually don't have answers about. And they're kind of bringing them back into reality, into existence. So, and it kind of culminated in an third day with an exhibit and the launch where the women themselves could kind of both display their work, but also if they wanted to interact with researchers, activists, academics, policymakers, who wanted to, if they wanted to understand the kind of like what conflict and gender, or what gender justice would even look like, right? So what I can, and this is a small example of memorialization, essentially, like how do the collages acted as a medium of memory building and memorialization of the conflict in a way that they hadn't been able to do. And Colombia is actually has the most extensive legal reform in the post-war period among many post-war countries that have emerged from conflict. Colombia has the I think, one of the highest number of laws that have come into place. And even for them, they felt a lack of the processes that happen. So, for example, Sandra Beltran, one of our participants, talked about how memory and justice kind of go beyond finding the bones of our loved ones, go beyond peace agreements or repeating our history. Memorializing and justice go hand in hand with our rights as victims, right? And again, these rights as victims is not the rights that you see on paper that states give rights to victims, right? And then Maria Inés Castiblanco talks about how sometimes I'm stressed because here in Colombia, everything is a conflict. And every battle, every search for justice is a conflict. So in some ways, memorializing helps her alleviate that pain. So this workshop it's a small intervention, I would say, into understanding the fullness of this and all the different ways. But it showed us that spaces like art can supplement or even do the things that institutions are unable to, which is memorialize and acknowledge the multiple focal points of war and multiple focal points of the post-conflict experience, right? Of a stated post-conflict experience, and how this acknowledgement of memorialization is integral to conceptions of justice and re-emergence from conflict. So what does this mean? Does this mean we need to do away with laws at all? Well, no. I think we have gotten this question before, well, the laws are there. I mean, of course they're there, and because as much as they do create problems, we cannot deny that for most people, they're still the base or the language for many people to still make claims. And many people do benefit from the laws that come. However, we could do away with how much we focused on just laws. We would need to kind of refocus our priorities, right? A refocus would kind of see rights as just a start, like provision of rights on paper is just a start. And how do we then bring justice as a goal would be how we would refocus this. A refocus would kind of trouble something like the Women, Peace and Security agenda that reinforces a kind of heteropatriarchal order, right? That places women at the center of it, and in which efforts to eradicate gender inequality sometimes even deepen gender differences, right? And a refocus will kind of shift our reliance from top-down theories of change, which seek to dismantle patriarchal dominance while fiercely defending militarism and capitalism. That, if we have to make women equal, we put them into militaries, or we put them into into spaces that were traditionally seen as masculine, or which believe that systematic reform can be enacted by technocrats or politicians instead of ordinary people who are actually the people who have the most experience of their own experience, right? Instead, a refocus would build on the collective power of the subaltern, the people who kind of peripheralized, to kind of grow movements demanding a radical reordering of power operates. Of course, this might seem a little bit vague because we do not have all the answers, as I said, but I do think it's a great starting point to kind of think about how we can supplement what we currently have and what we need to be focusing towards. So with that, I will end, and I will wait for your questions. Thank you so much.